On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, we speak with Don Flanagan of the St. Paul Chesterton Society about his upcoming conference talk down in New Orleans this summer on G.K. Chesterton and Sir Walter Scott. Well, hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense, the official podcast of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. My name is Joe Grabowski, VP for Evangelization here at the Society. I am joined today by my colleague, VP for Operations, Lee Sondeno. Hi, Lee. How are you?
I'm good, Joe. How are you?
Very good. Thank you.
Good.
And we're very pleased to welcome to the program today, as I mentioned, one of the co-leaders of the St. Paul Chesterton Society, who will be speaking at this summer's conference, Don Flanagan. Hi, Don.
Hello. Hi, Joe. Hi, Lee.
Well, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on here. And before we get into kind of the discussion of the talk that you'll be giving, we're having all of the speakers in these months leading up to that conference come on and kind of tease their topic a little bit for the interest of our audience, let them know why they don't want to miss this. But before we get into that, maybe just give us a little bit about your background of reading Chesterton, how you came to read Chesterton, what excites and interests you about him, and maybe just about your personal background.
Sure. So I was born in New York City, but I moved to Minnesota to go to graduate school in English many, many years ago. I met my wife, and we've been living here in St. Paul ever since. I did get a PhD in English at the University of Minnesota after college at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I was not that aware of Chesterton while I was in graduate school or early years teaching after that, but somehow, I'm not sure, I can't remember how, I came across him. It was part of my reversion to Catholicism after 40 years of wandering in a spiritual desert. And I learned that there was a Chesterton group meeting in the Twin Cities. It was headed by Dale Ahlquist. And so I started going to these in the 90s. And I just found them wonderful, intellectually, spiritually, socially. So after a while, I started going to the national conferences as well, and I found those even more rewarding, intellectually stimulating, and spiritually enriching.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, so that's my background. I'm now retired, and I work on the weekly bulletin for my parish here in St. Paul, and I'm the editor of a pro-life academic journal called Life and Learning. This is the journal of the University Faculty for Life, a pro-life organization of university professors in all sorts of disciplines, literary, scientific, and other. In fact, I'm in the midst of preparing volume 33 of the journal. So
Wow.
this is occupying my time at the moment.
Well, that's great, and congratulations on that. And we will have some links down in the show notes for the audience to go engage with that or look that up if they're interested. It's funny what you say about, going to grad school, and I won't speculate as to kind of when that was, probably a little earlier than I did. But unfortunately, that situation has not been remediated to my knowledge. Most graduate programs, most undergraduate programs simply do not deal with G.K. Chesterton. And so it's always exciting when those who have committed themselves to research in this field, who have committed themselves to literature scholarship, take a serious look at G.K. Chesterton and give him the treatment that he deserves as one of the great figures of 20th century writing, and certainly engaged with so many other writers because of the content of his work, because he sort of functioned, second to being a journalist, I would say, sort of chiefly as a literary critic. What do you think about his place in sort of both academia, but also just the place of Chesterton in English letters?
Well, you're absolutely right. He's shamefully neglected or disregarded in the academy generally. I remember a story told by Father James Shaw, a great Chestertonian, professor at Georgetown for many years, unfortunately, uh, after my time there.
Hmm.
But a student came to him and said, Father Shaw, I've written this paper and I use a Chesterton quote in a footnote to support my argument. And my professor circled it and said, you can't use Chesterton. He's not a reliable source, or there was some criticism of that. And all Father Shaw could do was sigh and roll his eyes and, say, this is terrible, but this is the way things are,
Mhm.
even at Georgetown. So I agree. He's shamefully unknown. But when I discovered him, I thought, well, this is how fantastic. I think I remember reading Orthodoxy and just being, knocked off my feet by how brilliant it was and how it resonated with me in many ways. So, although I later led a reading group in my parish, and I assigned orthodoxy to that group, and I was somewhat surprised at the lack of positive reaction. I mean, apparently Dale has a real point about the need for a book that introduces Chesterton. That's
Hmm.
why the Apostle of Common Sense 101 are needed, because some people just don't respond to Chesterton himself directly initially. That there's a process or a time of something you gradually come to think, wow, I just want, I'm glad there's 35 odd volumes in the collected works. There's a lot to enjoy.
I think that's an interesting point too, because I think there's some parallels maybe to Sir Walter Scott, where I think a lot of people that I talk to, you ask if they've ever read anything by Sir Walter Scott, and they say, no, of course not. We've heard of him, but we've never read anything.
So I inherited a whole bunch of old books from an elderly aunt who had married into a bookish family. And so I had all these books on my shelf, and I look at them, and eventually they reproached me. I would look at them and think, oh, I need to read these books. So I started with Sir Walter Scott. I have a lovely set of 24 novels, I think, the
Wow.
Waverley novels. And I started in a couple of years ago, and I've worked my way all the way through. And I discovered they are fantastic stories in a couple of ways. One, they have important Catholic elements that are not widely known or understood or appreciated. And two, they would be great books for high school kids to read. They're challenging and open to them what I think of as a magical world of chivalry, romance, manly virtues, and adventure. So it occurred to me at the conference in Pennsylvania last summer that there would be a good conference talk in reviving Sir Walter Scott as a, well, I think one of my working titles is Sir Walter Scott, a great Catholic novelist, question mark. Uh, and what's interesting to me about it is if you read about Sir Walter Scott, what he says, he's a modern, rational Protestant. He even wrote in a letter in the 1820s he was opposed to Catholic emancipation. giving Catholics the right to vote and hold office and so on. That didn't happen until 1829.
Hmm.
But if you read the stories, there's a strong Catholic element in many of them, and the reader's interest is engaged on the Catholic side, on the side of the old faith, Catholicism, on the side of uh, the underdog, uh, on the side of the Jacobite interests and people who wanted to restore the Stuarts to the throne, and those were largely Catholics. Uh, anyway, that interest, that side, comes up again and again in these novels. Now, uh, Chesterton has a wonderful essay on Sir Walter Scott in his book 12 Types.
Hmm.
It's 4 pages of sheer brilliance. Uh, and he talks about how Scott was instrumental in reviving interest in uh, the medieval age and the romantic element in literature. But he doesn't specifically address the Catholic element in many of the novels. And that's what struck me as I was reading through them.
Well, it's definitely a fascinating thesis, just from afar, and not having, obviously looked at your research and such. I can say I'm intrigued. Just for the benefit of the audience, maybe to set some of the background here. So, Don did say there that Scott was a Protestant, Scott Presbyterian, uh, Scotch, I should say, Presbyterian. So we
Actually,
don't con-
he was a Church of Scotland
Church of.
Anglican.
Oh, that's right. That's right. He had some Presbyterian family background, I think, as I recall. But he was almost a perfect sort of 1 century prior, you know, analogy to Chesterton in that he lived from the 70s into the 30s of over a century. He, in this case, the 1770s into the 1830s. So, we would call him a Georgian, and then he had lived through what's known as the Regency period. Um, but yeah, I think that, as you mentioned, this is a time in England where Catholics were really regarded as second class citizens. So to discover somebody with his background, but also at that time, who might have some Catholic thematicity to his writings, I think would be pretty surprising for people. And also, I think, though, I can imagine how one would find that, because he does write these historical novels, the most famous of which probably is Ivanhoe, right, which is set back in medieval times, and that was the Catholic world, right? That's when Christendom was united, at least in the West, as a Catholic polity. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating kind of angle to take on another neglected author.
Yeah, there are other reasons. There was actually an article in the Lamp, the Catholic magazine, about Sir Walter Scott last November,
Hmm.
and the author makes the argument that these are great novels to read as because they help students master difficult material. You have to make your way through a fair amount of Scottish dialect. He if you start mouthing the words that the usually the peasant characters are speak when they're speaking, you can hear what they're saying, although they use a lot of words that are unfamiliar. You have to
Mhm.
just get some way of getting through that. There are also long prefaces and introductions. The author who wrote the Waverley novels was unknown for about the first 10 novels. Uh, and it was amazing. Scott had a group of about 15 or 20 people who were in on the secret, and they all kept the secret. But he also has these elaborate, what I would call scaffolding about these stories and where they were found and, all that stuff. And my advice to modern students is skip all that. It can get you bogged down. Just
Hmm.
dive into the story itself, and the adventure, the morality, the virtues, the romance. For instance, in the novel Rob Roy, which is about the 1715 uprising, I do not think there is a more appealing Catholic heroine in all of English literature than Diana Vernon. Chesterton, in his essay, says, well, one of Scott's weaknesses is he's not that great at portraying female characters. And I'd say, yeah, largely true, but I would say Diana Vernon is the exception. She's beautiful, she's brilliant, she's resourceful, she's brave, she can ride, and she can shoot. What's not to like? And she's 18. One of the interesting things is the novel is narrated by Frances Osbaldistone, who falls in love with Diana Vernon for obvious reasons. And you keep wondering and thinking as you're reading through the book, are they ever going to get together? Uh, and then at the very end of the novel, he says, well, of course, Di Vernon and I have been married for many years. So he kind of jumps over the whole courtship phase, and he's now well past that, and they're an old married couple. But that's okay. The adventure is fantastic. Guy Mannering, Old Mortality. There are two novels. One, the Monastery, and his sequel, The Abbot, that are about that short period in Scottish history when there were still Catholic monasteries and they were big landowners. They had tenant farmers, just the way, nobles in England would have tenant farmers. And the Scottish government was going through the Reformation and how long would this monastery survive and who would be loyal to it and who would abandon it and so on. And uh, there are characters who are not very attractive in the monk population. There are good monks and bad monks and so on. But you get a sense that I never got anywhere else of what was it actually like for a monastery as it was about to be shut down
Yeah.
and the monks dispersed, or if they were going to try to fight back. Anyway, those are specifically about the Catholic versus Protestant issue, but there are many other novels where it's a theme or an element that runs through it. And the reader's interest, I think, is engaged on the Catholic side. It is also true that Scott grew up around ruins of Scottish monasteries and played there. He was kind of imbued with a sense of Scottish history, which was the old faith, the old way of life pre-Reformation. He built his baronial estate, Abbotsford, within sight of other famous monastery ruins. And I was reading that in his final illness, he was comforted by reading or having recited to him the Dies Irae and other Catholic hymns. So that tells me there was a deeper emotional part of him that responded to the Catholic element, and that comes through in the novels.
Hmm. Yeah, Lee, I'd be interested to pull you in here because, the regular listeners, viewers of the show will know that we don't plan these things. It just sort of happens by providence or what have you. That there's been a recurring theme now, kind of through many of our conversations, and I think it will continue leading up to the conference of that kind of moving target of what constitutes the Catholic imagination. What do we mean when we say that term, Catholic imagination, especially in fiction? And Lee and I just had a recent conversation on this show about um, F. Scott Fitzgerald. We had a Tolkien scholar on a few months back. We'll be talking about Walker Percy here coming up. So, there's this sense in which the Catholic imagination, whether or not a writer is Catholic or what have you, it's in the soil. It's in the air they breathe, kind of. And I think that that's true here. Lee, do you have any thoughts at this point?
So I think it's interesting. Sir Walter Scott was, pretty famously was able to take the perspective of people outside of his kind of his normal sphere of influence into his writings. And I think Waverley is a really good example of that. The lead character is an Englishman, right? And so there's always this sort of element of looking at something through the lens of somebody else, of a different, maybe a different country. Maybe it's a different religion. And I think that's where maybe what you're saying, Joe, about the Catholic imagination is he was able to view that through those specific lenses. I think another good example is just the beauty of it's the title "Lady in the Lake," I believe, where I think was it Schubert who wrote Ave Maria after just the beauty of that novel. So there is this element of bringing in this Catholicity into these stories, and even sort of a Britishness into these stories that brings this lasting value to Sir Walter Scott. I think most people that are listening who maybe haven't heard of some of these novels, and a lot of the stories of Robin Hood are, have been sort of memorialized and popularized by Sir Walter Scott, who was
Yeah,
Scottish,
which comes through in Ivanhoe. You start reading about
right?
this friar who lives in the woods, and gradually it dawns on you, this is Friar Tuck.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, yeah. So, but it's interesting because I think even in the lexicon of British history are some of those stories that were invented by Sir Walter Scott. So he's even influenced the imagination of an entire country. If you're looking for some examples of what we all know about, Robin Hood and kind of hitting targets and splitting the arrow, like that all came from Sir Walter Scott, right? That
Absolutely.
wasn't even something that was part of I guess the British origin of Robin Hood. So I think it's kind of interesting that we're talking about bringing in these elements of Catholicism, because Walter Scott was a master at it, right, and doing it on the scale of national identity as well.
Yes, absolutely. I Speaking of Ivanhoe, when I was trying to give my students some sense of the history of the English language, I borrowed this bit from Ivanhoe where Scott explains how the Normans, of course, conquered after 1066 the Saxons, the Anglo Saxons, who had, of course, conquered the Roman Britons a few centuries earlier. But the Anglo Saxons were then in a position of subservience to the Norman overseers. And that's why the words for domestic animals like pig and cow and sheep are Anglo Saxon words, whereas the words for the meat or the dish that comes from those animals is Norman French. We have poultry, we have beef, we have venison.
Hmm.
And I thought, I can't improve on Scott's wonderful explanation. And I would hear from students, oh yeah, well now that they get it. There's something that they pick up on that.
Yeah, it's something that occurs to me too, as Lee mentioned, Waverley, that there's an aspect of Scott's imagination that is sort of world building or has an interest in a world building, and that exercise that you described, which you said to readers to kind of skip it. Sort of this conceit of where these manuscripts came from or how they were found and their formation. Um, we mentioned Tolkien already, but that's sort of the further up and deeper in that the nerd like me will get into with Tolkien. Most people are just going to read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and be done with it and be satisfied. For me, I relish and delight in going into both the actual historical, real world 20th century textual formation of those stories, which Christopher Tolkien did such a great job elucidating, but also the in-world formation of the Red Book, of how Bilbo's writings get ultimately passed through first to Frodo, and then Meriadoc does his own redacting and revisions, and then ultimately Samwise Gamgee is sort of the custodian of this, and that kind of in-world layering, I think, shows a certain kind of imagination that is what makes a fantasy realm. Not to call Scott's novels were historical, but we could say to a certain extent maybe historical fiction, historical fable adjacent, or whatever you want to call it. They have that kind of a quality of a fully realized world that we find in other authors that are really adept at that, like Tolkien.
Yeah, Chesterton says in his essay on Scott that, like Dickens, Scott has created characters that live on in your imagination, and that,
Hmm.
like Dickens, Scott could be thought of as creating a never-ending story. Uh,
Yeah.
in another part of that essay, he contrasts Scott with modern fiction. He says modern fiction, like Henry James, burrows into human consciousness like a mole, whereas Scott's fiction rises and crashes like a wave.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great description, and it is this contrast that So I'm more. I mean, I've read the 12 Types essay, but another place that you actually find some insights from Chesterton on Sir Walter Scott that I was just skimming through in preparation for this episode is in the Victorian age in literature, which, as we kind of already covered, that if you know about the periods of England, that should kind of like raise a question mark, because why is he wasn't a Victorian, right? Because Chesterton goes out of his way to sort of describe what Scott does, how it leads to some of the things that are great in Victorian literature, and then also where he will differ and go apart. And I think that real focus that comes later, which Chesterton is, let us say, I think in the final assessment, pretty ambivalent about, which is psychological realism and sort of the introspection of characters within works
Hmm.
that we see as sort of the predominant theme of the novel in the 19th century. Um, he says, Chesterton's not necessarily reading works for that. What he likes is great narrative, great plot, great again scene setting, and I think this is what you'll find if you read Chesterton's novels as well. That you don't get a whole lot of internal monologue in free indirect discourse, right? That's not his mode of writing. He's writing. Um, it would be pejorative to call it picaresque, but he's writing these adventure stories. That's what Chesterton has an interest in fiction.
Right. The psychological realism of a novelist like George Eliot, that's far away from the world of Sir Walter Scott.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with reading George Eliot or Anthony Trollope, but there's something just magical about entering the world of Sir Walter Scott, just like there is in entering the world of Tolkien.
There is. Well, I think there's a lot to look forward to, and just to help our listeners, our readers, excuse me, viewers, anticipate. I think there's fodder for rich conversation. And even if you're not necessarily familiar with all of these authors, I think that you'll start to pick up on themes as you if you come to our conference, join us down in New Orleans this summer, because, I can't help but think that we have another talk at the conference on another novelist who wrote medieval historical fiction, but from a very, very different kind of approach, namely Sigrid Undset. So Amy Fahey at the conference will be talking about Sigrid Undset, and talk about a gulf between Kristen Lavransdatter and Ivanhoe, for example. But on the other hand, they're both sort of of the same period. They both do that world building, but one is the intense modernism of psychological realism and that mastery, and then you have this other thing to kind of compare and contrast and find out
Mhm.
what you value most. So I think it's going to be a really exciting prospect for some kind of little afterglow chats at the conference this year.
Oh, I'm looking forward to those.
Absolutely. Lee, any final thoughts as we kind of get toward our wrap up here?
No, just thanks again, Joe, for having another English major on the podcast. I think we're having a little sort of English major renaissance here. So that's great, and looking forward to chatting with some other English majors maybe at the conference about going, like you said, further up and further into some of these authors and characters that others that aren't nerds like us wouldn't do as readily. So looking forward to connecting with you, Don, as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Don, any last thoughts for our viewers and listeners, or maybe tell them why they just need to come to this conference? You've been to several conferences before, so uh, your last thoughts, but also maybe give us a little commercial as well.
Well, it was a revelation to me as I worked my way through the Waverley novels about how Catholic the sympathies were and how good the novels were. And subsequently, I've also come to realize how good they are especially for high school students, uh, to stretch their minds and their reading comprehension.
Hmm.
So I'm looking forward to hearing more about Sigrid Undset also, uh, and to giving this talk. Uh, I keep learning more about Walter Scott. I've read a couple of biographies, and he was fabulously successful. Although he was also a silent partner uh, in a publishing firm that went bankrupt, and he almost lost his house, his baronial estate. I mean, he wrote his way out of bankruptcy. Uh,
And
it,
now his
it's
face
really
is on
quite an
the
inspiring story. Just that.
and now his face is on the Scottish notes as currency to live on forever.
Well, it's going to be, I think, a great conference again. Great talks like this, great discovery of new books for your shelf. But as Don was saying in that anecdote that he shared, books hopefully that you don't just put there to look pretty, but you'll actually maybe open up and read. Maybe some of these books are already on your shelf. So if you have them there at home right now, you can read them in preparation for the conference. If you're still not convinced, come down to New Orleans at the end of July. Join us, have a listen, have a conversation, maybe a fine beverage and a cigar if you're inclined at the afterglow, and discern whether or not you want to add some of these to your collection. Don, thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you, Lee.
Always a pleasure.
Good talking to you.
And thank you, viewers and listeners, for taking time out of your day. Please do all the things that we need your help with to make this podcast grow. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to get notifications about new posts on the channel. And please do invite others to, take a look into this as well. Maybe you know some people who are fans of Sir Walter Scott, maybe of Chesterton, maybe people who have never heard of Sir Walter Scott, whoever it happens to be. Invite them into this great conversation with us, because as we always say here, Chesterton and I imagine Sir Walter Scott are always better with friends. Until next time, God bless.